So today we have Matt Deible from Odos here. Odos is an optimal DEX aggregator for token swaps across multiple blockchains. Hi, Matt. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Yeah, doing well. Thank you. Thanks for taking the time to meet with me today. I'm not sure. I know we've done some things together in the past at ETH Denver, done interviews and things, but we haven't gotten too into depths with Odos. And I was curious if we could start off and maybe you could give just a very simple overview in kind of simple terms, as if I'm 5, maybe 10 years old. What is Odos?
Absolutely, yeah. So basically, the high level is there's lots of different ways to essentially convert one token into another, whether it be a currency or some other tokenized asset. So there's lots of different ways to do that on a chain, and basically finding the way to exchange tokens in which you get the maximum output is a very hard problem because of how many ways there are to do it. And sometimes you may have to exchange through other tokens to get to the token you really want. So Odos basically looks at all these ways, it aggregates all these ways to exchange one token for another, and it tries to find the optimal way to take your input token and get your output token such that you get the maximum amount of output token.
Okay, got it. So I believe you refer to this quite commonly as a non-linear path. And I guess I'm curious, how do you personally define a non-linear path compared to a linear path? And how does that mean something better for the end user?
Absolutely, yeah. So this one is a bit hard to put into simple terms just because it's...
We can go complex here, that's okay. We got the simple one out of the way.
Yeah. So I guess I usually say the best way to kind of see it is through our visualization on our app. We sort of have a Sankey diagram that shows the flow of the input through all these intermediary tokens and dexes out to the output. I guess to try to put it in more concrete terms, usually when you route through, let's say from token A to token B, there may not be a direct pool for A and B, right? So you may need to go A to C to B. And that's sort of a linear path through tokens you can think of. You may also be able to go from A to D to E to B, right? So that's a completely different linear path. And now you can imagine maybe you can even split between those two paths, split between those two linear paths to get a higher output, because a lot of times through one of these linear paths, you start decreasing the price and you start getting less and less output as you put more and more in.
Okay, so
I can stop there for...
No, I guess that brings up a few questions. So you're talking a little bit about, so basically if somebody's coming in, if I'm understanding this right, with a large amount of token A, and they're trying to get to token B, there's a bunch of different paths. And
exactly.
Depending on the path, there could only be so much liquidity through each path, which would mean that there'd be some like arbitrage opportunities or something, right? That's kind of being taken into account.
Exactly. Yeah. So now we have sort of these different linear paths, right, that you can split between. But now imagine that instead of just going through a linear path where you go through a list of tokens, you now keep on splitting, right? So you may go from token A to token D, I think the example was, and then you can send some to token E and some to token B. You can split again. So you can sort of keep on splitting, and you end up with a much more complex sort of web of transactions. And sometimes that can get you even more output than just combining the linear paths.
Okay, so when you're splitting all these linear and non-linear paths, how do you make sure that it's gas efficient? Or are we talking about such large sums of tokens that the gas becomes a little bit of an afterthought?
No, for sure, yeah. So what we directly optimize is output value minus gas value that you pay to execute the swap. And so for small swaps, you're not going to see much of this complexity, right? So we search this complex search space, but if it doesn't yield a better rate net of gas, then we're not going to propose that as the final solution. We'll propose a much simpler path. But having access to that complexity leads to better rates in quite a few scenarios, especially when there are large sums of money being traded. But even when there's smaller, more reasonable sums on a cheaper network, like an L2 or an alternate L1 that's quite cheap.
So it sounds like you're kind of taking some of these arbitrage out. Well, I guess I want to take a step back. So there's this strategy where people are arbitraging between different decentralized exchanges, right?
Right.
So it seems like what you're saying is that with Odos here, you're able to sort of eliminate that need for the arbitrage as it brings this symbiosis between exchanges.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair to say. I think to some extent, you can look at it as sort of embedding arbitrage within the route. I think it's important to sort of make clear that there's a space of arbitrage in between where like it would be profitable to capture on its own, right? Because the gas cost is too high, versus embedding in another route with other DEXs. The additional gas cost of adding it to an existing transaction is a lot less than the gas cost of just capturing it in its own transaction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm thinking there's probably a lot of advantages for exchanges that are just getting started or smaller exchanges that don't have substantial liquidity. They could use something like Odos on the back end, and they'd be able to get access to a little bit broader liquidity.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, you mean on their front end?
Yeah, on their front end, yeah.
For sure. Yeah, and that's something we've been exploring recently, is integrating Odos into DEX front ends to both more efficiently utilize their pools as well as to tap into other liquidity in scenarios in which that's beneficial for them.
Okay, got it. Because you guys have your own dApp. If somebody comes in and they want to swap tokens, that's the best way to use an Odos type exchange, I'm guessing, is your direct, DEX.
Absolutely, yeah. That would be the recommended way, because that's what we work on and build. But it's hard to, of course, get everyone there, right? So if we can sort of bring those same benefits to other user interfaces that already have lots of users, rather than trying to get those users to come over to our dApp, then that's a win, right?
Yep, got it. So you guys are offering different ways for people to kind of get involved, namely through this main dApp. I guess what do you see as sort of these long tail effects of Odos, right? I know you guys are getting your exchange up and you're kind of opening up these API points I saw. What does it look like with more people using Odos? What's it mean for, both the exchanges and blockchain as a whole? I'm also very curious about for the end user, since they're the ones who are doing a lot of these transactions.
Yeah, for sure. So yes, there's a lot of things here. One thing I would say for the DEXs themselves, I think it's overall a very good thing. I think sort of the lifeblood of a DEX is volume through it, right? And so either you need a huge user base using the DEX itself and exclusively their pools, which many have, right? And that's what helps them grow and maintain TVL, is that they have a large audience swapping through their pools. But a lot of DEXs don't have that, right? But if they're integrated into us or even another aggregator, we will continually route through them when they offer the best price. So they will continue getting volume through their pools, even if they don't have their own big user base. So in a way, it sort of promotes a more diverse DEX ecosystem, right? I would say it promotes a more diverse DEX ecosystem, and it also promotes more efficient DEXs, because if your DEX can provide better prices, then it'll get routed through more and it'll get more volume, and that'll create more fees for LPs, which will make more people put money in, and so on.
Got it. So it kind of has this larger scale effect. So if you're routing all of this between different exchanges, we're kind of heading into this multi-chain world, right? There's L2s, there's L1s, there's alternate L1s and EVMs, and there's a bunch of different ways that people can interact with DEXs in a lot of different places. Is there anything on the horizon that would do stuff that's a little bit cross-chain? Does that work with what Odos has on the horizon?
Yeah, so that's definitely something we're thinking about. I don't think it's going to be added in the immediate term, and the reason for that is because it's very messy still. Doing cross-chain stuff with bridging, you always have to wait a long time, and you're putting trust while you're waiting in some centralized party, typically, depending on the bridge.
Sorry, I'm curious, like, what do you think is messy about the cross-chain landscape?
So the bridging in particular, and again, this is relative, right? But relative to a transaction that's completely contained within one chain, where it happens atomically. If it doesn't happen exactly the way you want, you can roll it all back. You lose both of those things when you go cross-chain. You lose the ability to roll it back. So if you have, let's imagine you're executing an order route across two chains, right? It's split between two chains. You execute the first part, you can check if it went all right. If it did, great, you can move on, you can start bridging. If it doesn't, you can roll it back, right? So that's all good. But now you're bridging, you have to wait for the bridge, but once the bridge completes, you can now execute the other part of your order route. But now the prices have changed for one, right? So you should probably just go back and recalculate the route entirely, because the optimal route a few minutes ago is not the optimal route now. And two, even once you do that, when you go to execute it, if you want to roll it back for any reason, you can't roll back past the bridge, right? Because you lost that atomicity that you used to have. And so that's not to say you can't do it. It's very valuable. I use those types of products because there are lots of cases in which you need to take an asset on one chain and get an asset on another. So it's definitely very valuable, but it is very messy from our perspective.
Got it. That makes sense. So I think I interrupted you a little bit when you were explaining why you couldn't do it, but maybe you kind of gave a little bit of a recap on that. Okay, so Odos is a project by Semiotic Labs, right?
Semiotic Labs, yes.
Semiotic Labs, yeah. Sorry. Is there anything else you have on the horizon? What could you tell me a little bit about this labs and what it is, where you guys are headed?
Yeah, absolutely. So Odos is a product within Semiotic Labs. The other major project Semiotic Labs works on is the graph. So we have a team that acts as core developers on the graph. And the graph, just to, I guess, briefly cover that, is a data indexing layer for indexing and serving data, more structured data from the blockchain. So part of our company does work on the graph as core developers, and specifically they work on applications of artificial intelligence and cryptography, and specifically snark cryptography, right? So mainly figuring out how we can potentially use snarks within the graph to make it more trustless is the main application of snarks.
So it sounds like, so I'm familiar with the graph, and I'm familiar with what you're doing now. It seems like those are two kind of separate directions of things. How did this project Odos come to be? Like, where did the idea come from? Was it directly from labs, or is this something of your own?
Yeah, absolutely. So they are very different, and they're sort of like two very distinct sort of projects now, which is great. It sort of arose from, I would say, just a general exploration of DeFi, right? So I guess I was working on the graph originally, and specifically I was working on AI problems within the graph. So more specifically studying how the various agents in the graph can sort of be incentivized to act how we want them to act, right? So you can get a healthy sort of economy of indexing, selling, finding data, while still being fully decentralized. So I was working on that, and that was sort of my entry into crypto in general. So it got me looking more into DeFi specifically, which is something I hadn't looked at before. And from there, the AMMs in particular were very interesting, and routing through the AMMs became a very interesting problem to try to solve. And so we sort of worked on that for a while as sort of just a side project, and we got to sort of an MVP that seemed to provide a lot of value over existing options in the market. And so at that point, it sort of became its own project.
Got it. So you had mentioned something that was pretty interesting while you were explaining this idea. You were talking about how you were working on building healthy economies that are fully decentralized. And I'm curious if you could explain a little bit more, what are the pieces you think are necessary to create a healthy decentralized economy? I know that's so much of what the blockchain is. It's trying to keep things as decentralized, but keep everybody also incentivized. And everybody has a little bit of a different view on what this is and how it can be construed. And I'm curious what you think, Matt, about this.
Yeah, so it really is. I think it all comes down to the incentives, right? And I think the specific incentives you need in place and the ways you have to consider those incentives interacting with one another depends a lot on the application. Within the graph, it was interesting because there were sort of defined roles, and sort of it was interesting even defining what the health of the economy is, right? Like you can sort of look at it and decide if it's healthy or not, but like trying to nail down concrete numbers to define the health is always hard in of itself. Yeah, I'm sure. It's like, how do you fully quantify anything? It's like decentralization is on a scale. Nothing can be completely decentralized. It's always somewhere there's pockets of different things. Yeah, so I guess I would say maybe the hardest part there is actually fully defining the risks and the goals, and doing that in concrete terms, such that you can then design incentives around that. That first step is I think challenging in of itself.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. Right. It's difficult to quantify anything without defining rules, and then taking it a step further to make sure that those rules align with the goals back again is a little bit tricky. So what's next for you? What's on the horizon?
Yeah, so I guess Odos is the full focus for me now. For Odos in particular, there's quite a few things. I think there's, as we mentioned, our API is a recent development, so getting that integrated in more places. There's so many great use cases for it, I think, and especially as use cases of crypto grow, it'll grow with that, because ultimately everything is based on these sort of tokenized assets and potentially even non-fungible assets, right? That can also be potentially integrated into this routing problem.
Could you explain that a little bit? If we could go off on a small tangent, I'd be curious to know what you think some of these big use cases are, particularly with the non-fungible sort of assets.
Yeah, so I guess specifically including them in our routing is the interesting thing we've been thinking a little bit about, and I think this is probably a bit farther off, but this is sort of what Uniswap has started to do, right? They acquired an NFT aggregator, and now they have sort of this universal router that is able to route both ERC20s and NFTs. And I think there's a lot of interesting space for that to potentially be integrated into us as well. I think NFTs in general, most people think of just the JPEG, right? Because that is a lot of what they're used for right now. But in general, it's really any item you can own and send, right? So like one is domains, ENS domains. That use case has been, I think it's very clear that that's a great use case now, and that utilizes NFTs, right? And I think there's lots of other potential. I don't know what necessarily will be brought on chain, but you can think any sort of item or document you own off chain could potentially be put on chain, right? So there's I think there's a lot of interesting, more obviously useful applications of NFTs in the future. And I think there's definitely a potential to include that within the routing problem as well.
Right. So back to this API that you've created, there's probably a lot of very long tail sort of effects that it can have, and a lot of different places that people can use it. What do you see as something that's like a pretty big hole in the marketplace, or a pretty glaring opportunity for somebody to use this in something that's currently there, or something that's sort of on the horizon?
Yeah, so one big one I think that we're excited to see is uses of multi-input and multi-output directly. So this is sort of a new feature we've created within our routing. I would say all routing, there's no other routing option that supports that right now. We were the first to add it. And it's interesting because I think there's a lot of use cases in which that is actually what you want, where you do actually have multiple tokens and you want to liquidate a portfolio, for instance, all into one token, or maybe you want to buy a portfolio all in one swap, or maybe you want to swap one portfolio for another, right? And all these things are done right now, I think, oftentimes by sort of just doing a bunch of single swaps, right? So I think natively utilizing multi-input and multi-output routing is going to have a lot of interesting applications. I guess one concrete one I can give is treasury rebalancing, right? So you have a treasury of assets. You want to keep some value split typically, but as the price of the assets move, the values of the assets move and their percentage of the treasury move. And so periodically you can sort of do a multi to multi route where you route the assets you have too much of to the assets you don't have enough of in the desired split. And so you can continue just rebalancing your treasury in the most efficient way possible, essentially, instead of just doing random single swaps to different assets.
So really, a fund who wants to keep 25% in ETH exposure, 25% in, we can say, Arbitrum, and then 25% in this, 25% in that. At the end of their period, if they say once a week or once a month, it could auto purchase these tokens. They could write a script where it would use this routing to purchase the tokens and make sure that it keeps the split that they're telling everybody that they're keeping, that all of the partners agreed is the split that they want.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. That's very interesting. So I know you said a lot about swapping into stuff, but does it also work the other way, where if somebody says they have, let's say somebody comes in with a lot of ETH, or a treasury is just starting 1,000 ETH, whatever it might be, could they just define what tokens they want and the balances, and just within one or two transactions collect all these tokens? And I guess the other question I have is this a single transaction, or is it a separate transaction for each swap?
Yeah, so it's a single transaction, and that's what makes it, I think, pretty cool. And this goes back to the nonlinear routing we talked about, right? Yeah. Where we were saying like splitting and splitting again and just continuing to split is sort of the unique differentiator in our routing, and it comes into use with multi-input and multi-output because you start already split between lots of tokens. So if you can continue splitting after that point, then it becomes a lot more useful.
Can you explain that a little bit to me on how that works? I want to wrap my head around, if I come in with tokens and I want to end up with 5 different tokens, how does that work to make it happen in a single transaction, where I don't have to do all these different transactions, just one fee that I pay one time to get what I'm looking for? How does that work?
Yeah, so for the multi-input, or I guess you said multi-output. So for the multi-output case, yeah, it's similar, but for the multi-output case, let's say you start off with ETH, like the example you were starting to give. You're a new treasury and you want to build a portfolio. You start out with ETH. When you execute your route, let's say into 5 different tokens, our router will, or you'll send the ETH to our router. Our router will send the ETH to our execution contract. Our execution contract will then, let's say, wrap the ETH to start. It'll wrap the ETH into wrapped ETH. Then maybe it'll swap all of that wrapped ETH into USDC. And then it will split the USDC and send it off to 5 different AMMs that have the 5 different output tokens. So it will send off, let's say, 20% to one AMM, 10% to one, 20%, 30%, 20%. And then all those AMMs execute their swap, and they send all 5 of these tokens back to our router, and then the router passes all 5 of those back to the user. So the user ends up with these 5 tokens that they want in the desired proportions that they want, and it all happens in one atomic transaction.
Got it. That's very interesting. Is there any concerns of like MEV vectors for all of this when you're routing to so many different places and taking all these different opportunities of nonlinear paths?
For sure, yeah. This is definitely a big one, and one we're thinking about more. I was talking earlier about how some arbitrage, there's lots of arbitrage that isn't captured because of how much gas it would cost, right? So you sort of need you need to pass the gas threshold of how much profit is available from an Arbitrum path for it to be captured. But what I was alluding to is that oftentimes the whole path, or more often part of that path, can be included in a route much cheaper than it would take to capture the entire arbitrage circular route yourself in a single transaction. So I think that space of arbitrage where it starts to blur the line, right? Because it's really just a better rate, right? We're finding the best rates. And so that starts to blur the line between, like, is it actually doing arbitrage within the route, or is it just utilizing better rates? But I guess ultimately, sometimes, yes, there is potentially arbitrage you might include that an arbitrage searcher would also be looking for. And in those cases, slippage can occur. And that's definitely something we're thinking about more as well.
Okay, got it. So what are the users saying? Like, do you kind of keep track of what the end user is thinking? Like, how are they feeling about this product, and how are they using it? Is it because sometimes I feel like you come out with this product, right, and it's something that's so novel and interesting that you can come up with all these different ideas and thoughts on how people want to use it, but they might come up with their own scenarios and use cases, and it can be a little bit of a departure. Does everything kind of align with what you're thinking, or how are they perceiving what you're rolling out?
Yeah, so I think, so the core, or at least a subset of the core product, just the single token to single token routing, that's something that existed before we came into the market, right? So I think there's tons of use cases where that type of thing is already used. And so our sort of system can definitely be applied to that as well. I guess one thing we've seen in particular to user reactions is we've seen, in general, users are very happy with the platform, right? And the rates it can get. We have had a few users be confused about the complexity, right? Asking why there are so many swaps being made, and why it costs more gas without looking at sort of the increased output and the better price they're getting. So that's been interesting to see, and I think that'll just sort of take some time as it becomes sort of more normal for that to sort of occur.
So I hear something like that, and it's like, it sounds like it's what you're saying is it's a little bit difficult to communicate to people how the strength of the protocol, it kind of pushes the fees to a different place, right? It's saying, yes, this might cost a little bit more gas, but in the long run, you end up net positive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's not super obvious to users sometimes.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not. A lot of people come in and they check gas, or they check one or two things, and then they sort of move on. But when you're giving them such a dynamic route, it might get a little bit confusing for them to kind of add up the math. Do you ever think about, what it could be like if you just like said, hey, this is just a great aggregator, and kind of left it at that and let people see the final outputs?
Yeah, so that's actually where I think more confusion arises is when you don't show. So like on our dApp, we have that giant visualization that shows what's going on. Mm-hmm. I think potentially with some of these API integrations, this has mainly been where it's popping up because people don't see that visualization. They don't know what's going to happen. And then they execute a swap, and then they see all of this stuff happening in their swap, and they're not sure why that's happening. Right.
Yeah. It's
so.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I was just going to say I feel like, I think there's definitely potentially confusion when just looking at the visualization as well, but I think it's potentially more confusing if a user finds out about it after they execute the swap.
It's such a fine line between what a user wants to know and what they need to know, and I think everybody wants to feel like they're the most educated and want to know everything that's going on. But there comes this point of maybe it adds some layers of complexity. It's seems kind of tough to navigate. Is that, how do you sort of navigate that? How do you make that decision that this is something that is clearly communicated? We need to show the path versus we need to, explain, because I'm sure you could break it down into detail and say, this is the gas that would be spent here versus this is the gas that would be spent here. You could pull up any number of metrics that you want to share to the user, to kind of communicate what is going on here.
Yeah, so I guess we did have a large sort of discussion about whether or not to even show the route, right? So that's, as we were just saying, that's sort of a decision that can be made. Does the user need to know? Do they care? Mm-hmm. And so I think we ultimately kind of went the opposite direction with that. We tried to make it more interesting and easier to look at, without showing basically numbers and words everywhere, sort of like percentages and stuff, and instead showing those percentages visually by sort of the size of the visualization at that point. Mm-hmm. And then sort of making it a focal point of the page in a way that sort of is part of the design and less about just like throwing information everywhere. And so that's sort of the direction we've gone in our UI, which is interesting.
I've got to say, I've looked at the flow charts that you have for the different routing quite a few times, and they look incredible. And it makes it, like you said, it makes it so obvious what is happening in a visual way where I feel like I don't even need to read all the details. I can just see it and I get it, right? I put in this token and then it splits it however it's going to split it. And then it ends up in this other token, which is it's really cool. So now that we're like, have a good understanding of what's going on, what does success look like for you in this? Is this, I'm sure you're seeing some levels of success now, but at what point are you going to sit back and say this was a huge success? I can maybe start looking onto other projects and start building other things, or do you think that'll never happen? You want to keep perfecting this Odos product?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's many sort of, well, I guess in the future, there's going to be many aspects to Odos as well, right? Mm-hmm. So the vision is for Odos to be sort of a DeFi aggregator, right? And then there's many products you can build off of that. One is the SOR. Another that we're looking at is a pricing service. So taking all of the DeFi tools and platforms we're tracking and using all that information to determine a fiat price value of all these crypto assets, which may be tens of thousands of tokens on a given chain that have on-chain liquidity. I think there's many other ways we can sort of utilize and package up all this data that we're aggregating. So those are all interesting future explorations. And then I think there's also other aggregation products that could potentially be made in the future beyond just the routing, right? You could think of potentially a lending aggregator or a perp aggregator or anything else. So I think the focus will continue being on this sort of DeFi aggregation platform more generally. And I think there's a lot of room to grow there.
Yeah, okay. That makes a lot of sense, because I've noticed that it's not referred to as a DEX aggregator, right? It's a DeFi aggregator. So it sounds like you guys plan on finding different areas of DeFi so that people can kind of come to you as the hub and get whatever the best value is for something at the time.
Right. Yeah, we've been kind of walking that fine line of branding, because most people, if our main product is the SOR, and most people know that as a DEX aggregator, right? Mm-hmm. So don't want to lose that recognition, but ultimately, yes, we're trying to aggregate DeFi more broadly. And so that's, yeah.
Okay, got it. So kind of rolling it back to my original question, which is, what does success look like? It sounds like you're going to stick with Odos because there is so much room to explore. It's not just this one DEX aggregator. This can aggregate anything on DeFi and bring in lots of different advantages. Yeah,
for the foreseeable future, yeah. And I think there's also a lot of room for the SOR mm-hmm. in particular to grow as well.
Could you explain a little bit about the SOR and define that? Yeah.
Yeah, so SOR just stands for smart order routing. So mm-hmm. It's sort of the process of finding the best route from one token to another, or multiple tokens to multiple. And that's sort of a ever continuing task as new DEXs and new ways of exchanging tokens continue to pop up. We have to continue integrating them. So that's always a fun sort of adventure, never-ending adventure, right? There's also sort of, I think, a lot of room for additional features to the core SOR. The most recent major one being the multi-input and multi-output that we added. I think there's potentially a lot of other sort of modifications or features to this SOR that could be very useful. And then I think there's the axis of just overall user growth, right? So I think right now we have a relatively small portion of DEX aggregator volume, but DEX aggregators also have a relatively small portion of DEX volume, and DEXs also have a relatively small portion of all crypto volume. So there's sort of like 3 degrees at least through which to grow sort of overall usage of the platform, which I think is interesting.
So I guess this is a little maybe off of what you're just talking about, but you mentioned other DEX aggregators. Do you guys use those in your routing at all? Do you ever aggregate to aggregators, or is it just purely creating your own routes?
Yeah, so we do not. There are platforms that do sort of fulfill this role as a meta aggregator, they're often called, where they basically query all the aggregators and then try to rank them, which is often somewhat harder than it might at first seem, because you sort of have to verify that the quotes are correct in everything in all aspects of the execution. But putting that aside, yes, there are these products that sort of query all the aggregators and try to rank them. And I guess the aggregators themselves are kind of trying to solve the same problem. So it wouldn't really make sense for one of them to aggregate the other, because they're both kind of trying to solve the same problem. So it's just a question of who can sort of solve it better. And I guess you could fall back to the other one if it was a better solution, but typically that's not done.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So what is your role in all of this? It sounds like this product's incredible. It's got a future. There's a lot of different things you're building. Where do you spend your time? What do you do?
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time on these continual integrations, making sure that Odos can actually access and route through everything possible, because at the end of the day, that's the main limiting factor. If it can't access a major DEX, then it's just not going to find the best prices, no matter how good your routing is. So that's sort of a continued sort of task, right? I guess more generally, I mainly work on the routing algorithm and the smart contracts. Those are the two main things I focus on.
Got it.
Most of that work ends up being on integrations often.
And what's your background? I know you're with the Graph and you're with this Labs, but what were you doing before all of this?
So yeah, working on the Graph was my first sort of CS job. Mm-hmm. Before that, I was a CS undergrad. Yeah. Oh, not a very long history, but
but an exciting one, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for taking the time to chat with me today. Very interesting getting to hear about Odos and everything that you've been working on here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me.